Hello everybody and welcome to this very special edition of the Mr. Bruff podcast. I have a special guest, Mrs. Hallahan. Welcome.
Hello, thank you.
And we are actually recording this in your neck of the woods in sunny Essex.
It's always sunny in Essex.
Now, who is Mrs. Hallahan? An online teaching legend, an AQA examiner, an author, a blogger, and just all-round well-known person in the edu-Twitter sphere.
All-round English enthusiast.
To check you out on Twitter is at
Hey Mrs. Hallahan.
Hey Mrs. Hallahan, that popular pop track from the 1990s. Okay, so we are myth busting. So the situation is this. You have examined AQA English Language Paper 1 and Paper 2?
I have, and the literature paper as well.
And in that experience, what you found is that there are lots of myths or misconceptions.
And just generally from teaching, from
Yes.
kids coming up with crazy things that they think is true about the exams and having to bust those myths with them.
Exactly. So we have got about 175 myths that we're going to bust today. So we're going to go through this list, and these are the kinds of things I hear and you hear regularly from students who perhaps have heard these sorts of rumours on the grapevine. And I think because the exams are still relatively new, there are some misconceptions.
It feeds into it, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Because we're learning every time we have an exam, we're like, okay, I've learnt that about this and that sort of thing. So there's a sort of a feeling from a lot of students that their grade will vary depending on the examiner they get. If I get a quote-unquote mean examiner, I could get a bad grade.
Yeah, this mythical examiner that's just in a bad mood and wants to give you a bad grade. And if you get a bad examiner and they get all of your papers, they're going to give you a bad grade on all of them.
Dun, dun, dun.
And of course it doesn't work like that.
No.
So
you've done it. So why don't you explain to us what does happen, how are the papers marked and that kind of thing.
So your physical papers don't get posted off to an examiner. It's not as if one examiner will mark all of your same question papers. In fact, on the language question, your exam paper will be broken down into each individual question, and each of those will be scanned, and then they'll be uploaded to different examiners. This idea that just one bad examiner in a bad mood will mark your paper just isn't true.
Okay, fantastic. Right, the next myth then is, as long as you use complicated terms in section A of the exam paper, you will get at least a grade 7.
Oh, this magical formula. If you put in lots and lots of complicated terms, of course, that's what will happen. You'll get a grade 7, which is as silly as it sounds, really, isn't it?
Yes, there is no sort of expectation of these, if you know 5 big words, you're in sort of thing. It doesn't work like that.
We're not expecting you to start whipping out some old, archaic Greek terms, are we? That's not.
And I know the 2018 examiners report, I think for both papers, said that, many students, where they tried to do that, they were using the words out of context.
Yes, and even if you have found something really interesting, say something like a peripeteia as a structure point, like you've spotted, it's got a turning point. If you identify it, call it peripeteia, give a quotation, but you don't explain the effects, what's the point of pointing it out?
And that's, again, the mark scheme, isn't it? Does clearly say, it's all about the effect. It's not about feature spotting. It's not about, knowing. Same with the language. Well, that's a metaphor. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. It's how is it used for a specific effect. Excellent. Okay, we can throw that one out the window then.
Yep.
Now the next one is one that is something I hear a lot about, the named poems. So a lot of students say to me, well, there's no point in learning this poem because it was the named poem last year or the year before. So if a poem is a named poem in, for example, 2017, the myth is that you definitely won't get it in 2019. And what do you have to say about that?
It's another wah moment, isn't it? I know this really bothers you as well. You don't like trying to guess what the poem's going to be.
No, I think you just need to know all of them.
Yeah.
That's why they're there.
It's reductive, really, to try and unpick which one it's going to be. And it's not as if AQA are trying to trick you here.
No.
It's just that it really could be any poem.
Absolutely. And I think, not on this exam, but on the AQA exam, not the last exam series, but the one before that, there was a year where I think it was Limbo came up twice in a row.
Yeah.
So not only could last year's poem be next year's poem, but, it could be a totally different one. It could be, there is no way of working it out.
No.
And
like you say, the best way to approach that, know all the poems.
Know all of the poems. I get a lot of people asking me, well, if I just learn this one and I learn a way to compare it to everyone, and I just think, look, guys, you're in school, your teachers will be teaching you all of these poems. I have made a video on every poem. There are revision guides. There's all sorts out there. There's no excuse to not just say, look, I need to know all of these 15 poems. And it's a bit of a, challenge. I appreciate that, but that's what it is. That is the course.
And actually, the more you learn, the more you know the poems, the easier those comparisons come.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, I like that one then. Well, we're doing all right here. Okay, so the next one is about the paper that is provided for you in the booklets for your answers. So this idea that you've got to fill up all the lines on the paper in your literature booklet or you won't get above a grade 4. What do you think about that one?
I once had a student who passionately believed this, and even when I told him it wasn't true, he didn't believe me.
Wow.
Because his big brother had said to him, no, you've got to fill up the whole booklet. That's why they gave you the booklet, to fill it up.
Right.
And he would write in this really big handwriting to try and fill up the booklet.
Oh, so he didn't even try and write more. He just tried to write really big.
He just tried to write. Have you seen the size of those booklets? They're
crazy.
Massive. Yeah, that's it's a massive myth. Nobody's going to count how many lines you've written in your literature booklet, and your grade is not decided upon how much you write, but of course what you write.
That's it. I mean, I know that I see lots and lots of answers where students have got like half a page where they haven't really said anything. So that doesn't get them anywhere.
No.
And I know again in the 2018 examiner's report, it was for language, maybe it was 2017, but it was essentially making the point that you don't have to write, fill the whole booklet.
Nope.
You just don't have to do it.
No.
Some people, now this, I suppose it's worth saying, some people do naturally have very big handwriting.
Yes, they do. Yeah.
And if that's the way you write, then you may find you do fill up all of the space. And maybe even in language, you will need some extra paper. But, that's almost, I think, why there is that much space. Because some people naturally have really big, loopy handwriting, and that's fine.
Yeah.
But you don't have to, suddenly... I can't believe that you knew someone who actually started writing...
He was trying really hard to fill it all up with this very sort of forced big handwriting, because he thought that magic grade 4 to pass... He needed to fill up the booklet.
Amazing. Can you imagine the examiner who got his paper and thought, wow,
I hope he believed me by the time he sat the exam. I did try and tell him.
Well, if you're listening, put a comment in the comment section. Let us know how you did. Okay, so the next one is one that you suggested, and this one surprised me. So the examiner, well, not surprised me what the answer's going to be, but that some people think this. So the examiner doesn't like it if you use the names from the story in the language paper. So why don't you just explain what you mean by that?
I've had this a few times now, that if you use the names of the characters in the language paper 1 story that you've just read, and you then have to write your own story, and if you get stuck for a name, or if you get stuck for thinking up a character and you use the name or the character from the story, the examiner won't like it.
Oh, I see.
And I said, but why do you think that? Why would they not like it? Because that's cheating.
Oh, just taking a name. So it's like the continued adventures of Rosabelle. It's like that kind of thing.
I've read that.
Wow. And that's
when she went out for dinner.
Yeah, exactly. And she wasn't actually so angry after all. So, it turned out well in the end.
Yes. As if that would be cheating. And it's really funny, because you and I know that a lot of books, lots of works of literature are continuations of older stories and reworking of different stories.
Absolutely.
So it definitely isn't cheating. Yeah,
I guess the lesson to learn from that as well is don't spend ages trying to think of the name of your character. It doesn't. It really isn't something, again, from the earlier point, the AQA exam board isn't looking to discredit you for something. No. So they're not going to say, exactly as you just said, they're not going to say, oh, look, you've used the name from source A, so I'm going to take a point off or something.
Yeah.
Crazy. Okay, now this one did make me laugh. If you get stuck, write the examiner a letter and ask them to mark you more generously. I have had this. I marked SATs papers years ago. There was a really long answer and it was supposed to be about Macbeth, and it was a student who wrote, I am writing this so my teachers don't shout at me because they can see I'm not writing anything, but I think Shakespeare is rubbish and why are we studying it? And of course, what was hilarious was I gave this person 0.
Yeah.
And I was thinking the school is going to call this paper back because they're going to say, no, she was working for hours because she'd written about 3 pages. So go on, talk to us about this one.
I've never had a letter as long as that. But I have occasionally had those little letters in the margin, or quite long letters on the back, where they pleadingly ask, please give me some more marks. I've had a really hard time. I forgot to revise. I've been revising maths and I haven't revised English.
Wow.
Please, could I have some more marks?
And what would be your response and the response of every examiner if they saw that sweet letter?
Well, I get a bit Shylock about it. Like, does it say it's in the bond? Is it in the mark scheme?
Wow. No. Nice reference. Yeah, exactly.
No marks.
Yeah, there's no benefit of doing that.
No.
I think there is something that's quite interesting, I suppose, and this is just a sort of a curveball, as they might say in the States. But if you are ill, so I've had a situation where somebody left the exam ill, and then you have to go and speak to the people in your school and they will deal with everything. So you don't write in your exam paper, because I saw this, I got to here and I'm sick and I'm going to be leaving. You just go to your teacher or the invigilators and they will deal with all of that sort of stuff.
Yes, it's done on a completely different system, and it's all to do with how ill you are, if you go to the GP, you go to the hospital,
exactly.
and etc, etc. Let the teachers and the exams officer to sort that out for you. Do not write about it in your exam paper. It's not relevant. Just if you feel that poorly, speak to your exams officer, put your hands up.
Yes, that's it. Okay, now this one is a personal favourite of mine because I've heard this probably 1,000 times. There isn't any point planning as it won't get marked. So you have been an examiner across all of these exams. So why don't you talk to us from your experience about what you do with a student's plan?
So I think before we get into what we do with it.
Okay, yeah.
When do students need to write a plan?
Yeah.
If you're answering the language analysis questions on the language paper for question 2 and question 3 and question 4, you probably won't write very much of a plan. You might jot down some ideas before you begin writing, but you won't write an actual plan. On the Shakespeare paper and the poetry paper and your pre-19th century paper, you probably will write a plan.
Yes.
And that's where when some students say, I'm not going to write a plan because there's no point, it won't get marked.
And the question 5s in the language paper.
And the question 5s. So those ones where you're writing for a much longer time, where you might have the ideas at the start. I mean, why do we plan? Why do people write a plan? Well, you want to get your ideas down to go back to remind yourself, what did you want to write? How was I going to answer this question? Where am I going with this?
Yeah.
And plans, I think you'd agree with me, are really important.
Yeah, and I think from my point of view, there is enough time to plan.
Yes.
So I totally agree. In the earlier questions, 1, 2, 3 and 4, in language, paper 1 and paper 2, there probably isn't enough time to plan in the conventional sense. You'll still think about what you're going to write. Yeah. You might jot down a couple of things. But when you've got a question that you're expected to spend 3/4 of an hour on it, and when we've seen from the examiner's report, look, you don't need to write page upon page upon page upon page. The allowance is that some of that time is for planning
and thinking. And even now, I'm sure when you sit down and you write your books and when you do your podcast, you plan down what you...
We have planned this.
We've definitely planned this. Just sitting with our plan in front of us.
Yeah.
It would be silly. Planning is for the person who's writing. There's definitely a point in planning. There's always a point to your plan.
Yes.
But in terms of how many marks it's given... Well, it's a bit different in that if you don't complete your answer, but you have written a plan, you will look at the plan. It's not as if the plan is discounted.
Yeah, the examiner will look at it,
you must look at it and you've got to tick to say that you've looked at it.
Yeah.
And if there's anything worthy of marks in the plan itself, you can, of course, award marks for anything that's written in the plan that is worthy of marks.
Yeah.
So it's a total myth, that one, and one that I hope that everybody listening is paying attention to.
Yeah, and I always think, I mean, this is just my personal opinion, but if you're, paper 1, question 5, if you're going to do something like a cyclical structure or, repetition of a motif or something, making that clear in the plan that you're doing it is quite good, because, it's sort of saying, look, this is what I'm planning, sort of, look out for it. Okay, lovely. Plan the big questions. The next one is then about the parts of the literature exam where you get a choice of questions. And it is this idea that if you get a hard literature question, try writing an answer for all of the questions, because then you can score more marks. So I guess we could talk about the thinking behind this, and also what would happen as an examiner if you saw answers to numerous questions.
Yeah, I have a bit of a confession. When I was a student, I once made this mistake.
No.
I did. I was in an exam, and it wasn't so much that I was trying to get higher marks by answering all of them, but I didn't read the instructions properly.
Yeah.
And I answered every single question on the exam.
Wow.
When you're only meant to pick 3.
And there were 175.
There were lots of questions, and I even did that stupid thing of working out how much time I should spend on each one.
Oh,
and when it came to like 12.38 minutes, I didn't think, well, that's a silly number. And just cracked on and did all of it. And then at the end, I realised what I'd done.
Yeah.
And I went to see my lecturer and said, I'm really sorry. And I think I probably cried a little bit too. And,
yeah.
And he said, how could you answer all of them? That you, like, for the whole year, there was all sorts of books on there. Like, that was because of all the different classes. And I said, but I read all the books.
Wow. So you had quite a good answer back there.
Yeah, I was still obviously as much of an English geek back then as I am now, and I think he took pity on me and I still passed, thank goodness. But
so you're trying to help the youth of today not to make the mistake you made.
Please don't make the mistake I made. It was really awful, and I still feel sick when I think about it. Wow. But I have also, as an examiner, had students who have done this, who have answered every single question on the literature paper. So all of those different Shakespeare plays, which they clearly had not read.
Yeah.
And I wrote very brief answers on every single one, and possibly an attempt, who knows what they were thinking, maybe they thought I'll get 2 marks on each of them, and there's so many, it'll add up to quite a lot. And of course it doesn't work like that.
I guess, and this is actually something I think that perhaps in mocks students don't know exactly what the entire paper is going to look like.
No, because you often only get the page that refers to.
So you will have, for literature, for example, let's talk about Shakespeare, you will have the paper will have a question on numerous plays.
Yeah.
And you will have to find the play that you studied in class, which is, Macbeth, probably Romeo and Juliet. There are lots of others, but those are the 2 most popular. And then you answer the question. And can you imagine? Well, I can't imagine. I mean, what even happens if somebody's answered?
Okay, so the exam paper's scanned in, and for literature, it's just your booklet. You don't have it's not like on the language paper where there's the question and the answer, question and the answer.
Yeah.
It's just the booklet. So the booklet's scanned, and the examiner will see in the corner, will look to see if they've written down which question number that you've answered, and then you tick a little box to say this is the question they're answering, and then you read their answer, and then you put the mark in the box that corresponds with that number. If a student answers every single question, then you have to put the mark for every single question in the box.
Oh, no.
But then the final mark given is just whatever was their highest mark for all the questions.
But the point is, and so someone might say, well, that makes sense then. But the point is, it doesn't make sense, because you need to spend that amount of time on one question.
Exactly. So it's always going to be
it's
not a good idea. It's a bad idea.
But it's amazing that sometimes I've had students come out of an exam in years gone by and they said, "So we've never even done that poem before."
Oh no! Did your heart sink?
And I'm like, you looked at the wrong cluster. Like, surely not. It is just mind blowing. But it does happen. I think the thing is, we can laugh about it, but the reality is, exams are so pressured.
Yes.
And students feel so kind of, anxious that you don't
think clearly.
No, and don't kind of think that you won't make a silly mistake, because it happens all the time, and that's, as example from your own experience.
And I like exams.
Well, you like that one. You did everything. Amazing. I love it. Okay, so the next one is about the paper 1 question 5 answer.
Oh, yeah.
And this is something, again, that a lot of people ask me in some variation. So you must use complex vocabulary in your story. If you don't use at least 10 examples of the complex vocabulary, you won't get above a grade 4, is the kind of myth we're looking at.
And if you use 15, then you can get a grade 6 and sort of funny formulas like that.
And what is the reality there?
Well, it's one of those sort of half-truth ones, isn't it? Those are the best myths that sort of rooted in truth. So we do expect you to use complex vocabulary in your story. That is one of the things that we look for when we mark your work.
Yes.
But there isn't a ratio of numbers of complicated words to your final grade, or even to the number of marks that you'll get. And just by using complicated vocabulary doesn't mean that you've used it correctly or used it well. What's more important than trying to think of memorising 10 words you're definitely going to use is just widening your own vocabulary and experimenting with words and trying to use them naturally in your work, rather than plonking them in and hoping for the best.
Yeah, and I sometimes think if you're not sure if it's the right word, don't use it, because the reality is that, quite often, it came up in the examiner's report, as we've talked about, some students will try to use an impressive word and they're not using it correctly. Yeah. And we're going to put this out in November, so there's plenty of time before the exams to improve your vocabulary through reading. Yeah. And I think if you you have to think about what you're reading, but if you go to your school library and you say to the librarian, I want to read a book that will, increase my vocabulary, improve my vocabulary, they will point you to something, and that's the way to do it. That
is the best way to learn words, and by asking about words. And if somebody uses a word that you don't know, not feeling like you can't say, what does that mean?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. I sometimes do that, and I feel a little bit...
Oh, I definitely still do that.
A bit silly, but...
Well, or you can always look it up.
You can look it up.
Look it up.
Okay, so... Another one now about how much you write in your answer, and there's a myth about writing on extra paper. Some people say there's no point in writing on it because it doesn't get marked. Now, clearly that's not true, but why don't you talk to us about this?
Well, I've heard, dare I say it, adults say this.
Adults
who should know better.
Dun dun dun.
Dun dun dun.
How can they do it?
Well, it's just wrong, isn't it?
It is wrong. What
would be the point of printing off the extra paper if they weren't going to mark it?
Exactly.
Of course they're going to mark it. It does get scanned in separately, and the extra paper will be marked by a senior examiner. So it's not as if it's not getting marked. It definitely will get marked, and it will be matched to your paper. Your paper has a special code on it that's individual just to you. Your extra paper has the same code. And it's checked that when it's put back together that it makes sense.
Oh, wow.
There's no way that your extra paper's not being marked.
Yeah.
So don't fall for that trap. Don't think, I'm not going to write on extra paper because it won't get marked anyway. That is a nonsense.
Absolutely. And so there's a sort of a balance, isn't there? Because you would hope that you could answer the questions in the space provided. The space provided is provided for a reason. But if you need more paper, you've got the time, you think, there's another idea I would like to write here because I've got 5 minutes left and I've finished that, then, do it. Yeah. Okay. Now this one, I think, is, if people are still with us 28 minutes in, this is something that I hear a lot. So there's an assumption that in literature paper 2 section A there will always be one question on character and one on theme, and what say you, Mrs. Hallahan?
What say us? That's not true.
Not true.
This, you might notice a pattern in the past papers and in the sample papers that schools were sent by AQA, and that pattern is nice to sort of see there's a bit of a pattern, but it's not true. It's best to prepare for different questions and then answer the one that takes your interest.
Yeah.
That's the best approach to take.
So that it could be that there are 2 questions on character or 2 on theme, or something that we're just totally not expecting. And again, this comes round to that thing, doesn't it? There are no shortcuts. You just need to know your text inside out. You need to know all of the characters, all of the themes. If there was a way of completing these exams where you could say, well, you don't need to know a certain thing about a text, then, the exams would have a flaw, and they don't have a flaw. You need to know these texts inside out, particularly with the exam being closed book. You need to go into those exams feeling really comfortable that whatever comes up, you can answer it. Fantastic. Okay, so now we're looking at the paper 2 again, and we're looking at that final question, that little question on the unseen poetry that requires you to compare 2 unseen poems. And it has been said by a number of students, well, surely there's no point in answering that question on unseen poetry, the final one, as it's hardly worth any marks.
Yeah, people leave it blank. And you think, it's just because you've run out of time? Or is that because you just haven't answered it? Is that a strategy? And it is a bad strategy.
Yeah.
Because it might just be 8 marks, but 8 marks is 8 marks. That could be a difference in a grade boundary,
yeah,
can't it?
Absolutely.
So there's every point in answering the unseen. But I think the best advice, watch the videos and giving tips on how to compare. Keep it nice and simple. Don't write loads and loads, but it's always worth answering a question.
Yeah, definitely.
You leave it blank, what mark will you get?
Yeah, 0. I guess the thing is as well that, it is challenging. One of the challenges you are faced with is managing your time so you can answer all the questions. So it's not like we're saying, it's easy to answer all of the questions fully, but that's part of what the exam is testing, and that comes through practice. So, if I sat down and did an exam paper today and found, I never got to finish this bit, then I would think, right, so next time I've got to spend a bit less time there or more, and you work it out. So, I think by the time you get to the exam, if you've been revising, if you've been working hard, nothing should surprise you. You should know, okay, I have a tendency to spend too long. I get it a lot from students. I spend too long on paper 1, question 3, English language.
Yeah.
Okay, if you know you've got that tendency, look at the clock. Give yourself, 10 minutes, whatever, and then move on. Have a process. It shouldn't surprise you.
And on that paper, you've just done the poetry question. And the best way to get quicker to answer the poetry question is know your quotations.
Yes.
So knowing the poems well, being comfortable with the quotations.
That's right.
Memorising your quotations rap.
And that is why it's a very special thing now. 32 minutes in, Mrs. Hallahan's going to perform the entire quotations rap. But we might come back to that, so we've still got a few more questions.
Let's do questions.
Okay, so spelling, punctuation and grammar. This is a very interesting one. So I have a playlist on full marks answers, and it hopefully dispels this myth, but it is good to talk about as well. Some students feel that they have to have absolutely perfect spelling, punctuation and grammar to be able to get the top marks for the AO6 part of the question in, obviously question 5, paper 1 and paper 2.
I think this idea of perfect is where this becomes problematic, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a spelling and punctuation. Well, the spelling is one thing, like being able to spell accurately, but of course you could get top marks in AO6, have a spelling mistake in your work.
Yeah.
But have really high accuracy. I mean, it depends on what you spelt incorrectly to an extent, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And you would expect it to be of very high quality to get full marks on AO6 or to get in the top band in AO6. But things like your use of punctuation, well, at that sort of level, your punctuation is going to be very complex. It's going to be quite it's a little bit arty almost, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
And there's different ways that you can punctuate the same sentence.
Yeah. And
so this idea of it being perfect, this isn't maths. English is very different.
Yeah, praise the Lord.
Thank everything. And you might deliberately break a grammar rule for a deliberate effect.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's okay. So, yes, it's that's definitely a bit of a myth that people need to understand. It's not quite as straightforward as everything's perfect. And equally, everything could be perfect and you won't get top AO6 marks.
Wow, we are really going in on this. I mean, this is yeah, you're right. No, go on.
Because you could spell everything perfectly, but you haven't attempted any ambitious vocabulary.
Yes, there we go. So if I take my son who is in year 6 and I take his work, and if there were no mistakes in it, technical accuracy wise, he probably wouldn't get full marks because he isn't. And I'm not going to say anything students should particularly try to do, but he isn't being extensive and ambitious.
Yeah.
I mean, he's doing his best.
Yeah.
He's 11 years old. 10, I think. He's either 10 or 11. He's a young lad. It confuses me because I have 2 boys who have, depending on when we ask the question, there's either like 2 years or 1 year between them. It's like we said, good job it's not maths.
It's a good thing it's not maths.
So I think the key thing here is, because I've seen full marks answers where there might be one mistake. It's not, this is not the expectation that for the highest marks you are literally writing a piece that is as good as the source you just analysed in paper 1 section A, that could be published tomorrow and an editor wouldn't have to sort of correct anything. But it is similarly not about making sure that you're accurate with everything, but just playing it safe. Simple sentences the whole way. The kind of, but I know that what I've done is accurate, that'll get me full marks. So it's actually, there's quite a nuanced point, isn't it? And it
is.
It's a good one. Okay, so here's a more complex one perhaps. I can't get above half marks if I fail to address one of the assessment objectives in my literature answer, e.g. context or language structure form. Now let me just say, by the way, let me remind everybody that we are reading out misconceptions and myths and then addressing them. So these are the kinds of things we hear a lot. So, I get out the exam, oh no, I forgot to put something in about structure, or oh no, I forgot to put something in about context. And I know from our conversations about this that this is not an easy one to answer, because there are different sort of levels to this.
And there's different levels that people might think they've not written about context.
Yeah, you go, yeah.
And actually they have. They've put the poems into the context and into the context of which they were written.
Yes.
So even if they've not written extensively about the historical context, they've written about the context of the things the poet's written about.
Yeah.
And that, of course, is context.
Yeah.
In terms of marks being lost, it's not as if you add the marks up and then you start knocking them down again.
No.
We're looking to award marks, and the point is that if you don't mention the context of Macbeth, then it means that your analysis of Macbeth is going to be a bit lacking, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So,
short answer, always write about the language structure and form.
Yeah, and context.
And context.
And the thing about context as well, and this is fairly, I think this is new, isn't it, with this exam, is that context is a very broad term. So if you look in the specification, it says context is not just what was going on at the time the text was written. It could be the literary context the text falls into. It could be the genre. It could be, the way different audiences or readers respond at different times and in different contexts. So, as you said, you do need to include context, of course, and that's not what we're not saying, as it were.
Of course.
But context is a broad term. And it is so much more than, an audience in Shakespeare's time would have thought this.
Oh, that sort of bolt-on.
Oh, and the kind of idea that, and this is another good thing, I think it came up in the examiner's report last year, it's not okay to just say, in Shakespeare's time, women were treated like this. In Shakespeare's time, you cannot make this overarching...
Women weren't powerful.
Women weren't powerful. So when Lady Macbeth says that, we're all like, what? That's a lady saying that. That's not the idea, is it? No. You can't give these overarching, sweeping statements about how the entire Western world was operating at these times. So context, I think, needs to be a little bit more sophisticated than just these kind of sweeping statements about the whole of, for example, the whole of the female sex, had this experience. Well,
Yeah.
doesn't really work. Okay, good. So here's a good one. And I think this is a very interesting one because I guess this is going to be mostly for paper 2, question 5, English language.
Yes. This is where it comes up.
Yeah, if my audience is teenagers, I should write in slang. So this is obviously looking at the point that you write in a register which is matched to your audience. And if your audience is, for example, a speech in assembly to your fellow year 11s or whatever, you do want to match what you're writing to your audience.
Yep.
But how much is too much, etc., etc.?
Well, it's not going to showcase the best of your abilities if you write in slang. It's not going to demonstrate that you can write well, or that if you write the entire thing in slang, then there's no control over different forms. And don't try and squeeze emojis in there. That's not what's going to impress the examiner.
Can you imagine? I bet it happens, mind you.
Yeah, it happens. And hashtags.
Things
like that. I mean, it might be appropriate to make a reference to something or to put something in quotation marks, and that's fine. And of course, we don't mean to be disparaging about slang.
No.
Or about accent or about dialect. However, you think about who the actual audience is, and that's your examiner. Will they understand what you're saying? Will they be able to follow your argument? If you write the entire thing in slang, highly unlikely.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things as well is you will make your content appropriate for your audience in the things you are choosing to write about.
Exactly.
So I think this is often overlooked as well. So I read a piece recently, a student's piece of work, which was a speech for assembly arguing for study leave.
Oh, that's a good topic.
It is a good topic. Or it should have been a good topic. But the piece read as if it was trying to persuade the students why they should be allowed to have study leave. And my feeling on it was, no, students are going to agree they should have study leave.
Yeah.
You've got to tell them, the benefits of it. So it almost read as if it was a letter to the head teacher arguing,
I see what you mean.
We're working so hard, we're so stressed, we're this, please let us have this study leave. So when you are given your audience, you have to think really carefully about how do I address this particular audience. It may not be through your vocabulary choices particularly, but it will be through the actual things you're going to say in the first place.
Understanding what motivates them, understanding what their concerns are.
Exactly. And similarly, there was a great question years ago. I was the examiner. Write a letter to your parents in which you persuade them to let you go on holiday with a friend this summer.
I remember that one.
Oh, it was great. I marked
really good.
About 300. And that was interesting because with your parents, you can assume a loving relationship. So you could so the best students were quite manipulative. They would say, Mum, I know I've been really stressed lately. You deserve a break from me. I know you want me to rest after my exams. It was pulling on and manipulating the loving relationship a parent would have with their child. Whereas if you're writing to your head teacher or you're writing a speech for a school assembly or something, you might not be able to manipulate the closeness of the relationship you have. You might be more formal and all of that kind of thing. Okay, so we've got to the end of our myths. I hope you found this useful. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you, Mrs. Hallahan.
Oh, thank you.
And the best place to follow your amazing work is probably on Twitter, would you say?
Yes, on Twitter.
So remind us again.
At Hey Mrs. Hallahan.
Hey Mrs. Hallahan. And there's a great thing pinned to your profile on there about the vocabulary and the poetry.
There is, yeah.
So we talked about that earlier, so go and check that out, everybody. And thank you for listening.